Okay, this is a lecture on the Spanish-American War and a continuation of imperialism. It's going to focus on the second half of chapter 27 that we didn't get to in class. So we'll start with the Spanish-American War, which Teddy Roosevelt himself called the Splendid Little War. And we'll start by looking at causes of war. Big thing you need to know, what leads us to the start of the Spanish-American War. So it really begins with Cuba. Cuba is a territory controlled by Spain, and the Spanish do not treat the Cubans very well. There are instances of Spain committing atrocities against the Cubans. The Cubans generally resent Spanish rule there. And a lot of these stories are reported in the American press. Now remember, this is the time of yellow journalism, so the stories aren't always true. The press will take their sensational reporting and exaggerate stories and various things like that. What it does is the American people read these stories about Spain's treatment of the Cubans and start to get outraged. And there becomes this idea that America should do something. Being so close to Cuba, they have a right and a duty to stand up to Spain and somehow defend the Cubans. So that will lend popular support to the war. Other things that will start the war, the Dulome letter. It's written by a Spanish diplomat criticizing President McKinley. The letter gets leaked to the press, and so then the American press is publishing about how the Spanish diplomats are criticizing our government. This also gets public support against Spain because how dare they say bad things about us. And then probably the last and final straw really pushing towards war is the sinking of the Maine. The Maine is a U.S. warship that was in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, and it blows up. Nobody really knows why. There becomes this report that it could be a submarine mine from the Spanish, so that the Spanish were attacking the ship. That is proven false. The Spanish did not blow up the Maine. However, the press kind of runs with that story. People start believing that story, and suddenly there becomes this call that we need to go to war to defend ourselves against Spain. Sometimes people talk about the cause of the Spanish-American War and they say the boat and the note. That would be the Maine and the Dulome letter. The boat and the note will also work for World War I, so we'll be talking about that again. And then one interesting thing they do before or when McKinley finally gives in essentially to peer pressure and says, okay, we're going to war, even though Spain had said, we'll have a ceasefire, we don't want war, is Congress issues the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment says clearly that once the U.S. helps free Cuba from Spanish rule, they will let them have independence. And that's really important. The Teller Amendment is pushed for by anti-imperialists who think this war is an imperialist war, which one could argue it is. But they want the Teller Amendment to say, hey, we're not going to practice imperialism, we're going to let the Cubans go free. We'll come back to the Teller Amendment after the Spanish-American War. So obviously, if you were going to fight a war against Spain over Cuba, you would begin your fighting in the Philippines, on the other side of the world. Spain controls the Philippines, so it is a Spanish territory. And it was considered a strategic location for the U.S., particularly for the U.S. Navy. Remember, this is the time where the U.S. is building up their Navy, and it's the idea of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a man named Teddy Roosevelt, that it might be a strategic location for the U.S. to acquire. So they will start much of the fighting of the war in the Philippines. General Dewey will manage to take most of the Philippine Islands and Guam. In Guam, it's pretty easy to take it because the people there didn't even know there was a war. So it's not much of a fight there. There is also fighting, obviously, in Cuba. the U.S. sends largely volunteer troops. There's a group known as Rough Riders, led by Teddy Roosevelt. These are mostly volunteers fighting for this cause. They'll have a great victory at San Juan Hill. In Cuba, however, the fighting is much more disorganized, and one of the biggest problems of the Spanish-American War, way more than the violence, is the disease. Being a tropical area, there's a ton of disease, and you'll see most people will die during this war of diseases. Eventually, pretty quickly, Spain will ask for peace. It is a very short war. That's kind of why it gets the name Splendid Little War. And we will look at the effects of the war. Okay, effects of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. actually gains a lot of territories. They sign a treaty with Spain, a Treaty of Paris, and the U.S. will gain the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. Cuba technically gains independence. We go back to that Teller Amendment, which said the U.S. was going to let Cuba have independence. But what upsets anti-imperialists is that although Cuba technically gains its independence, America passes the Platt Amendment, which limits Cuban sovereignty. So the Platt Amendment essentially says, like, Cuba can't sign treaties with others or take out debt or certain things without the permission of the United States. So they're following the Teller Amendment in that they're giving the Cubans technical independence, but they've put this rider on them, the Platt Amendment, which is limiting that independence, that sovereignty. That would really upset anti-imperialists. So the Teller Amendment can be seen as a pro-anti-imperialist idea. We're not going to keep Cuba. But then the Platt Amendment is a pro-imperialist idea in that, yeah, we gave them freedom, but we want to control them still. We want that influence, that dominance over them. When it comes to the Philippines and Puerto Rico, there's a question of what to do with them. For the Philippines, Americans are largely divided on the issue. There's pro-imperialist idea that we should take over the Philippines, and then there's anti-imperialist that it's not our business, we shouldn't be involved, and I'll talk more about their arguments later. But with the Philippines, we end up annexing them, and this will be a kind of big problem because Filipinos are very different people, very different culture, and so it's not going to be, and very far away, it's not going to be an easy time controlling the Philippines. Most of the Filipinos want independence, and they'll start fighting for it. And we'll actually see guerrilla warfare taking place in the Philippines against American forces trying to force the U.S. But the U.S. will hold on to them because of that naval strategy, pro-imperialist ideas, etc. With Puerto Rico, it's obviously much closer to the United States. And they decide to essentially take on Puerto Rico as a territory. The Foraker Act essentially makes Puerto Rico a territory of the U.S. They're going to operate, they don't get the rights of a state, but they will have a governor, and the U.S., they will become part of that U.S., particularly when it comes to like tariffs and issues like that. But they're not getting statehood, they're not getting representatives in D.C., and that continues to present day. With the acquisition of new territories comes the question of the Constitution. Here in America, we have a Constitution giving Americans constitutional rights. And this question comes up about, does the Constitution follow the flag? Essentially meaning in these areas we've taken over and conquered and annexed or acquired as territories or whatever, do the people there now have constitutional rights? And there are a few Supreme Court cases that kind of rule on this issue. You need to know, in general, they're called the insular cases. And what they essentially decide is that no, the Constitution does not follow the flag, which means just because we've taken over the Philippines or Puerto Rico or other areas does not mean that constitutional rights are immediately extended to the people there. So that puts us in a new kind of limbo in the idea that we now have these people that are living in territories of the U.S., but not full citizens with full rights of the U.S. And so it becomes an idea of, well, then what are they? And we'll talk more about that as we go on. So then the big two sides kind of develop as a result of the Spanish-American War, the pro-imperialists and the anti-imperialists. Anti-imperialists obviously oppose imperialism. The most famous group would be the Anti-Imperialist League. Their argument essentially is that imperialism is undemocratic, that democracy relies on consent of the governed. The people that live there decide, yes, we want this government, they have voting rights, things like that. And so anti-imperialists will argue that by taking over these territories, not extending that, some cases taking them over when they don't want to be taken over, particularly like the Philippines, that is undemocratic. It is not consent of the governed. And so many anti-imperialists don't like imperial powers. They don't like the big military that often comes with imperialism, and so there'll be this active vocal group speaking out against that. And we'll talk about that in the election of 1900. But there are also pro-imperialists who think it's really good for the country. There's obviously the arguments we've gone over before leading to imperialism and power and things like that. But there also becomes this idea that imperialism could unite the country, particularly after the Civil War, the South and North together. One thing people talked about during the Spanish-American War was that old Confederate generals and Northern generals were fighting together. I mean, most of them were pretty old, but there were some of them fighting. And so it's this idea that it could unite the country, bring together different groups, not only North and the South, but also maybe help with race relations. We'll see African Americans participate in the Spanish-American War. And the idea that it brings about patriotism could start uniting the races. And so people will use that as a pro-imperialist idea. Another area where we have to look at imperialism, separate from the Spanish-American War, is China. China has essentially been divided by the European powers in Japan. And they've come up with this idea of spheres of influence, that each nation would have different areas, different spheres in China, in which their country would dominate trade and investment in that area. It was a way of kind of combining their influence within China, so kind of dividing up the areas. Well, who is not in the spheres of influence is the U.S. They're a little late to the game. Everyone's kind of already divided it up. And so the U.S. is worried that they're going to lose out when it comes to China, that they won't be able to trade and invest in this up-and-coming nation. And so the U.S. decides to call for an open door policy. There's a famous document called the Open Door Note, in which the U.S. essentially lays out this policy that you need to know. And the Open Door policy argues that all countries will have equal trading privileges. Instead of these separate spheres of influences, we'll push for more equal trading privileges around the whole area of China. Nobody says no to the open door policy. They don't say yes, but they don't say no, and so the U.S. will kind of take that as a okay and run with it. So it's a U.S. proposed policy to help them get influence in China. And the U.S. will start to get slowly more involved in China. It should be noted that not all the Chinese supported this European, U.S., Japanese influence within their country. And there becomes a movement known as the patriotic Chinese, those who want China to be China, get all these foreigners out of there. And one thing they're going to really rebel against is the influence of Christianity. We've talked about how with imperialism comes the spread of Christianity. Missionaries come to these countries hoping to use it as a grounds to spread Christianity. And the same has happened in China. And one example of opposing that missionary, showing like, oh, they're not okay with that, would be the Boxer Rebellion. In the Boxer Rebellion, patriotic Chinese will rebel particularly against the Christian influence. They'll kill missionaries, they'll kill Chinese Christians, they'll kill foreigners, and it's really quite a big, powerful rebellion. It will eventually be put down by an international coalition, but it does show that obviously, right, not everything from foreigners is being welcomed, particularly Christianity. We've seen this before, right? You could go all the way to like Pope's rebellion back, seeing this kind of rebellion against pushing cultures on different people. The last kind of thing in imperialism is to start Roosevelt's presidency. Roosevelt definitely can be considered one of the imperial presidents. So one thing people forget about Roosevelt is he isn't initially elected president. In the election of 1900, McKinley is running for his second term. Roosevelt will be running as his vice president. He is running against the perpetual candidate, William Jennings Bryan, and it becomes, the election is an issue of imperialism, with McKinley being pro-imperialist, Bryan being anti-imperialism. And McKinley does win in the election of 1900. However, shortly after the election of 1900, McKinley is assassinated, and that will be how Teddy Roosevelt initially becomes president, taking over for assassinated McKinley. During Teddy's presidency, we'll be talking about a lot about what happens at home and progressivism, but there's also a lot of foreign affairs that happen during this time. One big thing during this time is the Panama Canal. We've kind of talked about Panama earlier in U.S. history. There's always been an interest in Panama. Just looking at a map, Panama is super long and skinny, and it seemed for a long time that it would be really easy to build a canal there. The U.S. is now especially interested in the Panama Canal because that shortcut through Panama, as you can see on the map below, would make it pretty easy for the U.S. to get to its new land and territories, not just on the West Coast, but also now Hawaii and the Philippines and Guam. So it becomes an idea that really is pushed for by a lot in the U.S. at this time. If you'll remember earlier when there was talk of a Panama Canal way back when, it was really a fight between the U.S. and Great Britain. They had the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty in the mid-1800s, which the U.S. and Britain said no one was going to build a canal there. But finally, Britain will relent and say, okay, you can build the canal there. So the U.S. now has permission from Britain, which is great, except for the fact that Panama is currently at this time controlled by Colombia, who does not think the U.S. should have permission to build a canal there. And so what essentially happens is, in order to get what he wants, Roosevelt and other diplomats will orchestrate a revolt in Panama against the Colombian government. So they're essentially helping Panama overthrow Colombian rule. The U.S. Navy does back them up, and then Panama will gain its independence. What is one of the first things the new nation of Panama will do is give the U.S. the rights to this canal. And so in 1904, they will begin building the canal. It will take 10 years, so it's actually done after Roosevelt's out of office, but that start of the canal comes under Roosevelt's presidency. And we'll talk more about the canal as time goes on, but it's obviously going to help with imperialist ideas and things like that. Teddy Roosevelt has a bunch of different foreign policies, ideas at this time. He is considered an imperial president, and one thing that gets associated with Roosevelt a lot is big stick diplomacy, coming from the quote, "speak softly and carry a big stick." And what it essentially means is Roosevelt is not afraid to use military force. And what he'd like to be able to do is diplomatically negotiate a lot of things, but he believes if he has a large military force backing him up, a big stick, it will make negotiating and getting what he wants a lot easier, because they know, right, he can back it up with force. he believes a president should lead boldly, and he'll kind of follow that in a lot of his policies. One thing Roosevelt does do, not just with Panama but with all of Latin America, is he will pass the Roosevelt Corollary, which is essentially a build-off of the Monroe Doctrine. So the Monroe Doctrine, which said, hey, Europe, stay out of Latin America, the Western Hemisphere, U.S. is going to worry about it, you don't belong. And the Roosevelt Corollary builds off that, saying the U.S. will intervene in Latin America whenever necessary. Europe, you don't need to intervene. So it goes a step further, not just saying we've invested interest here, but saying we'll be the ones to intervene, no one else needs to. And we'll see that kind of be followed into the 20th century. Additionally, going with Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, we'll see the Great White Fleet. This will be the buildup of the U.S. Navy. If you remember, Roosevelt got a lot of his start in the Navy, so he's obviously pretty partial to it. But he will build up a Navy that is quite large and quite powerful. It's often called, one part of it is often called the Great White Fleet. And what he does with them is essentially send them around the world on a tour, not fighting, but kind of demonstrating U.S. naval power. Showing off U.S. military strength. They'll do military exercises to kind of push the U.S. on the world power stage. Roosevelt will also deal with relationships with Japan. There is a Russo-Japanese War, which is between Russia and Japan. So the U.S. is actually not fighting in that war. But Japan wins the war. It's a big shock to everyone because Russia had been a pretty powerful nation. Japan had not up until this point, although they had been militarizing. And here the Japanese win. It will be Teddy Roosevelt who will help negotiate the peace, and it leads to problems with both countries. Japan is also angry because no one's happy with the peace. Japan is also angry at this time because of the poor treatment of the Japanese in California. Japanese immigrants have been coming over. Like other immigrants before them, they are facing discrimination. Particularly, California will start doing segregation of the Japanese. And so Roosevelt will eventually say a gentleman's agreement with Japan, which essentially limits Japanese immigrants to California. In exchange, the U.S. will be nicer to those immigrants that are already there. So it's kind of a way of limiting immigration without outright limiting immigration. Last thing you need to know is that the U.S. will try and pursue a friendship with Japan, which will last for a little while. We know they switched sides in World War II, but it lasts a little while. That's the Root Takahira Agreement, and it essentially just promotes friendship with Japan, so trying to balance that relationship in Asia. That's really a wrap-up of imperialism, and that's where we'll stop for today.